Welcome to the video recording of a webinar on exploring the relationship between religion and racism. This program, held on March 12, 2023, is part of a series on faith and culture in American society, presented by Interfaith Communities for Dialogue, or ICD. Board member Marie Monson opens the program with an introduction to the ICD.
Thank you, Judith, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm sitting in today for 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝, our ICD chair, who was unable to be with us this afternoon. And I'll provide just a brief introduction to ICD, and we have a slide here that I hopefully will. Do you have? Yeah. There we go. Yeah. ICD is a network of faith-based and associated organizations dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and positive relationships among diverse people in and around Fairfax County through education, engagement, and support. It was founded 19 years ago by representatives of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths. As you can see from the slide, we're now at 11 members representing 6 faith groups. We promote inclusiveness, integrity, respect, and trust of all people, and stand in unity with and support of each other. One way that we do this is by conducting dialogues or workshops such as this one. ICD started conducting virtual workshops and dialogues when the COVID epidemic made in-person get-togethers risky. So from October 2020 to March 2022, ICD held a series of 5 virtual workshops on aspects of systemic racism and the effects on people of all races. Today's program is part of another series on faith and culture in American society, the first of which was held in January, and the third will be coming up in May. We'll have more on this later. Now I would like to introduce 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐬𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝. Geneva is a member of the ICD board and also the chair of the working group that has set up this workshop. And I will ask her to take it from here.
Thank you, Marie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all. Let's begin with a quick overview of the next couple of hours. In a moment, I will introduce our esteemed speaker for today. While he's speaking, as Judith said, feel free to submit any questions that may arise using the chat function. These will be seen only by the hosts and will be held for the Q&A session so that they don't disrupt the flow of the program. After the presentation, we'll move into small groups to give everyone a chance to share their thoughts on this topic. When we gather again as one group, you will have an opportunity to ask a question by using the raise hand function on your screen and being called upon in turn, or by entering your question in the chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. Reverend Taylor is the president of Sojourners, a Christian nonprofit organization which publishes an award-winning magazine about faith in action for social justice and peace. Reverend Taylor has previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group. He has served as vice president in charge of advocacy at World Vision USA, senior political director at Sojourners, executive director of Global Justice, an organization that educates and mobilizes students about global human rights and economic justice. He also served in the White House Office of Cabinet Affairs and Public Engagement as a member of the 2009-2010 class of White House Fellows. He is a graduate of Emory University, Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology of Virginia Union University. He is ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Convention. He is the author of a new book, A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community, which is fundamental to our goals for today's discussion. We're delighted to welcome you, Reverend Taylor, and look forward to learning from you.
Thank you, Geneva, for the kind introduction. I want to thank the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue for inviting me to join you on this Sunday afternoon. It's great to be with you virtually and hope to get the opportunity to meet many of you in person at some point. I'm excited to be with you, and I want to reflect a little bit on a theme. I'm not certainly here to preach in a formal sense, but I am certainly going to draw upon my own faith and also dwell upon some of what I've learned from other faith traditions as well. But I do want to tag a kind of title onto my message, which is really kind of a remix of Dr. Martha King Jr.'s final book. Many of you may be familiar with it. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community? And my kind of remix version of that title is Where do we go from here? Toxic Polarization or the Beloved Community? I'm grateful that you just heard a little bit about Sojourners, but for those of you that are less aware of what we do, we are actually celebrating our 50th birthday as an organization. And for 50 years, we have been trying to inspire Christians of all stripes, often working in concert with other faith traditions, to help people put their faith into action for justice and peace. Because we believe that a commitment to justice and peace is integral to our faith. It is not an optional commitment. It is something that is required and something that we should be doing courageously. Before I kind of jump in, and I'll just mention that we have a publication, both a magazine and a digital publication. You can learn more about that at sojo.net, sojo.net. But we also have a action arm called Sojo Action, where we equip and resource churches and others on how to do the work of social change and engage in a range of different campaigns, working in everything from immigrant rights and immigration reform to racialized policing and transforming our justice system. Done a lot of work on economic justice and poverty. We have a campaign focused on protecting our democracy and the sacred right to vote, which I'll talk about a little bit later, called Face United to Save Democracy, and much more. I want to start by sharing a little bit about my own story, because I think it directly connects to the theme that we're focused on today. I was born in the shadow of the civil rights movement and became convinced that my generation inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. My Black mother and white father made the controversial decision to marry each other in 1968, the same year that Dr. King was assassinated, and what was a tragic turning point in our nation's history, where our nation became gripped and crippled by a deep degree of polarization around the Vietnam War and a backlash to many of the advances of the civil rights struggle. It's not lost on me that my parents got married just 1 year after interracial marriage was legalized in this country through a case that was decided in the state of Virginia called Loving versus the state of Virginia that legalized interracial marriage across the country. Of course, that moment is perhaps the finest example of people channeling their faith into social action to dismantle the evil of Jim Crow segregation. It brought Christians of all races and denominations together, along with leadership of the Black church, and of course, working alongside the Jewish community as well as others who played a crucial role in the civil rights struggle. As I mentioned, Dr. King's final book had a very prescient title, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And I believe that our nation is still faced with a crippling degree of polarization. It is arguable that we are more polarized today, or at least equally polarized today, as we were during the height of the 1960s. In religious terms, it may even be what we often refer to as a kairos moment. Chronos is how we understand time in its natural state of affairs, but kairos is how God understands time. and Kairos can become a propitious moment for action and change. I learned from my experiences studying in South Africa in 1996 that Kairos moments are often precipitated by times in which our current reality becomes so fraudulent and so pernicious that it can force an awakening in our midst, a reckoning that can open up the possibility for radical transformation. Well, the summer of 2020, with the horrific murder of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, and so many others, combined with a pandemic that was apocalyptic in the sense that it revealed so much of the inequality and the brokenness in our society, provided some of the seeds for what could be a Kairos-like moment. Systemic racism, which has been with our nation since its inception, continues to disfigure our democracy, betray our nation's promise, and assault human dignity. Voting rights, particularly for people of color, continues to be under assault in many states across the country, in large part thanks to decisions by the Supreme Court conservative majority and to a Congress that is too polarized and too partisanized to pass the sweeping voting rights legislation that our country desperately needs. States are passing bills that are sanctioning schools from teaching about systemic racism, further whitewashing and suppressing a deeper understanding of our nation's history. Polls show that not only do we distrust and dislike Americans who have a different political perspective or from the other political party, but increasingly, the majority of Americans hate those with the competing political view. And instead of wanting to persuade them and convert them to their point of view, they simply want to defeat them. We are seemingly stuck in a zero-sum, us versus them style of politics, what often referred to as a politics of division. And seemingly we seem to be in a cold civil war that turned hot in the violent insurrection of the Capitol on January 6th. Everywhere we look, we see the signs of a deepening polarization in our politics, our culture, and even in our congregations. And underlying that deep polarization is a growing recognition that within a few decades, white people in this country will constitute a minority of the country's population. This inevitable demographic shift sadly has become a source of great trepidation, anxiety, and fear among many white Americans, even as it serves as a source of hope and pride for many others, particularly communities of color. But if this nation doesn't embrace this trend, the fault lines of race and color will continue to pull us apart. In my faith tradition, Jesus said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." As long as America is defined by the normalization of whiteness and the primacy of white culture and people, we will remain stuck in a vicious cycle of crippling division and acrimony. The lie, and in religious language, the sin of white supremacy, which has been with us since the inception of this nation, manifests itself today in racist and xenophobic rhetoric that asserts that white people are the true or original Americans. It's also evident in the claim that racism is somehow a vestige of the past, or that it's only tied to individual actions. Fallacies that rationalize and perpetuate long-standing inequalities and injustices that are so often systemic in nature. According to a recent poll by Brookings and PRI, 17% of Americans believe that the US is a white Christian nation, and they are willing to fight to keep it that way. 40% of Americans in this poll believe that because things have gotten so off track, true patriots should resort to violence. My brothers and my sisters, these are alarming statistics, and they demonstrate that one of the biggest threats to our democracy is the resurgence of a white Christian nationalism that showed up on January 6th, but also that has seeped into many different parts of the Christian church, particularly within the evangelical church. But I believe that as people of faith, we, borrowing from the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, must be prisoners of hope, that there are reasons still to be hopeful, that the American experiment can still be redeemed, that we can indeed have a fourth founding of this nation that can help put us back on a track of truly embracing a just, inclusive, multi-religious, multiracial American democracy, where our diversity is not seen as a threat or a liability, but instead becomes viewed as our greatest strength and as our greatest asset. I believe that until our nation becomes more of a people with a shared memory, history, and future, we will remain stuck in this us versus them and limited good mentality. Such a mentality says that the more you give access and opportunity to others, the less access you will have for yourself. In her brilliant book, The Sum of Us, Heather McGhee describes this racialized zero-sum mentality as the OG lie that so often keeps our nation from realizing its full promise. This lie exacts a severe economic cost, not just on racial minorities, but on all of us. This seductive and dangerous mentality makes people afraid of anyone getting access to the privileges and opportunities that they might enjoy, which makes equity for others seem like a threat to your own privilege and security. But I believe that this mentality rubs up against the very core teachings and values that bind together our faith communities. And that while, yes, faith has often been weaponized in ways that exclude and harm and oppress, faith has also been tapped into to be a force for incredible change. It has been tapped into to unleash hope and possibility. It has been tapped into for the cause of liberation and transformation. So I want to reflect a little bit on how is it that we can get our country on the right track. When we think about Dr. King's dream, so often he described his dream for this nation as being tied to what he described as the beloved community. In one of his early victories, really his first major victory in the Montgomery bus boycott, during a speech after a court case led to that victory, he said that the end goal was not simply these more narrow civil rights victories. Instead, the end goal of the civil rights movement was redemption. The end goal was reconciliation. The end goal was the creation of the beloved community. Dr. King understood that the beloved community was a community that was rooted in a commitment to equality. It was rooted in a commitment to nonviolence, to agape love, to a kind of unconditional and sacrificial love. It was rooted in a commitment to wanting and trying to be our brothers and our sisters' keeper. Now, these values are rooted in our faith traditions, but they are also rooted in the civic values that are enshrined in our Constitution. A commitment, a promise of liberty and justice for all. Now, while we must acknowledge and reckon and even repent for the ways in which that promise has been so painfully denied to so many over the course of our history, we cannot let go of that promise. We must find ways to ensure that it extends to everyone. Just to give you a sense of how far we are from so much of the dream that Dr. King and other civil rights leaders had for our nation. Sadly, his dream has so often been a dream denied. For example, when 1 in 4 Black children grow up in the quicksand of poverty, dreams are being denied. When less than half of African Americans graduate from high school compared to 78% of white students, dreams are being denied. When Black joblessness is twice that of whites, and Black wealth is 1/10 that of the average white family, dreams indeed are being denied. When 1 in 3 Black men are currently under the control of the criminal justice system, dreams are being denied. When Asian Americans are being victimized by racist crimes and violence in the context of COVID, dreams are being denied. When Black and brown Americans were 2 to 3 times more likely to contract and then to die of COVID, dreams are being denied. But I believe that while, again, our faith has been misused and abused in ways that have exacerbated some of these trends and caused them, our faith also provides so much of the powerful antidote to these trends. But first, we have to become more clear about some of the ways in which religion has been used to sanctify and prop up a series of myths that are woven into the DNA of this country. In a book called The Myths That America Lives By, Richard T. Hughes identifies 5 myths that emerged in specific periods of American history that, to varying degree, continue to flourish today, often in combination with each other. Now, while most of these myths hold a kernel of truth and offer some potential for good, they have become absolutized and distorted in ways that have so often justified racism and white supremacy. Consciously or unconsciously, these myths form so much of the DNA of America, and they have also myths that are very much tied to our religious history. To use the terminology of my faith tradition, too often these myths have degenerated into sinful idols. The first is the myth that America is a chosen nation, which provides a religious foundation for the notion of American exceptionalism. This myth emerged among the Puritans in the colonial period. At its best, the myth summoned the Puritans to bear one another's burdens and to take great risks and make sacrifices to establish a new community rooted in Christian values. But at its worst, the myth filled the Puritans and other early American settlers with a sense of God-ordained chosenness that justified oppression and hostility toward the Native American population and led to a triumphalist and insular posture. Out of the first and second Great Awakenings, religious revivals in the 18th and 19th centuries, emerged the myth of the Christian nation. Despite the nation's non-sectarian founding, this myth promulgated a belief that America was fundamentally a Christian nation and tried to transform the country in that Christian image. Of course, we know that the US is founded with a commitment to the separation of church and state enshrined in the Constitution in the First Amendment. And yet, this kind of belief that the country is a Christian nation has mutated and evolved in different ways throughout our history and continues to show up today, as I mentioned earlier, with so many Americans continuing to believe that fundamentally this country is the kind of rightful place for Christians, and to be more specific, white Christians. As Catherine Stewart, a journalist, chronicles in her book, The Power Worshippers, the modern Christian nationalist movement is driven by a dense network of think tanks, advocacy groups, and pastoral organizations embedded in a rapidly expanding community of international alliances and united not by any central command, but by a shared anti-democratic vision and a common will to power. The movement does not seek to add another voice to America's pluralistic democracy, but to replace our fundamental democratic principles and institutions with a state grounded on a particular version of Christianity, answering to what some adherents call a biblical worldview that also happens to serve the interests of its plutocratic funders and allied political leaders. While many early Christians in the US were inspired by their faith to oppose slavery, far more twisted the Bible to justify the institution of slavery and the lie of white supremacy. Sadly, the Bible was then used to justify Jim Crow segregation, the disenfranchisement of women, and so many other evils. The myth of the innocent nation emerged in the 20th century, drawing strength from the other myths. America's innocence, according to this myth, is rooted in its sense of being chosen or exceptional, and in its supposed favor by God as a Christian nation. Consequently, America naturally stands for what is good and righteous and can do no wrong. The challenge is that when you take this myth to its extreme, it can easily blind us to some of our own imperfections and can justify a great deal of wrong and evil in the name of trying to do good. Now, I don't have time to kind of unpack all of these myths, but I'm emphasizing this because these myths provide a valuable decoder ring to help us better identify and resist the ways in which our history and religion within that history has so often been used to perpetuate injustice. in order to get ourselves on a different track, we must be conscientious and diligent in rejecting the ways in which these and other myths derail the project of forming a more perfect union. I want to close by emphasizing a positive vision. Yes, there are dystopian and pernicious moral narratives and visions that have taken hold of some parts of our country and even some parts of our religious communities. But I believe that there is a more positive vision that animated the civil rights movement that can be recast and reimagined for our current time. I already mentioned it earlier. It is the vision that Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer and Congressman John Lewis and Diane Nash and so many others cast for the civil rights struggle, understanding that the ultimate goal of the civil rights struggle was far more than just civil rights and voting rights. It was literally the redemption of our nation and its character. It was the achievement of the beloved community. Now, the beloved community is a vision that, some of you may be aware of. You may not be fully aware that the kind of origins of that vision came from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which Dr. King was a member of. Dr. Josiah Royce coined the words, the beloved community. I believe that the beloved community still possesses the greatest potential and power to unify Americans across so many of our deep divisions, that these divisions are not immutable and they are not intractable. But we need to contemporize the beloved community vision for our current moment and our current time. My most succinct contemporary definition of the beloved community is to build a society, to build a nation where everyone is valued, everyone is respected, and can thrive. It is to build a society and a nation where neither punishment nor privilege is viciously tied to race, to ethnicity, to gender, to ableness, to religion, or to sexual orientation. Now, what I love about this definition is it is both aspirational and visionary, but it is also quite practical. We can measure whether public policies and whether political decisions either exacerbate the ways in which so often punishment is tied to race and skin color in this country, or whether they help to dismantle that tragic reality. We can measure the degree to which policies either reinforce privilege or help to ensure that everyone is able to realize their full potential, and that we can level the playing field of opportunity in this great land. I believe that this vision draws together some of the best of the conservative traditions, emphasis on responsibility and the importance of bonds within community, with more of the progressive movement's emphasis on dignity and on human rights. It is a vision that has not yet been co-opted by one side or the other, which gives us an opportunity to define it according to our deepest civic held values as well as our deepest religious values. I believe it's a vision that doesn't just show up or resonate within the context of my Black church tradition. It is a vision that also resonates and shows up in Judaism, in Islam, and among the more humanistic tradition. It is a vision that truly transcends so many of our differences. When I had the chance to lead what was called the Faith Initiative at the World Bank, I had the privilege of working with a broad range of religious leaders and scholars and thought leaders. It was truly it was an immersion into the religions of the world. One of my first projects was to gather a group of interreligious leaders to identify some of the common threads that bind our world's religions together in a shared commitment to combat and ultimately end extreme poverty in the world. This was, of course, an ambitious task, and we knew that we needed a moral vision to supercharge the effort to achieve what is called Sustainable Development Goal number 1, to end extreme poverty by 2030, which the governments of the world agreed to do in the year 2015. So they agreed to do it the agreement was made in 2015 with the ultimate goal of achieving that goal in 2030. While bringing together this group, we were able to develop some shared language that showed up in a document, in a groundbreaking statement entitled Ending Extreme Poverty, a Moral and Spiritual Imperative, which provided a moral and religious narrative behind the goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030. The statement read in part, "We in the faith community embrace this moral imperative to end extreme poverty because we share the belief that the moral test of a society is how the weakest and most vulnerable are faring. Our sacred texts also call us to combat injustice and uplift the poorest in our midst. No one, regardless of sex, age, race, or belief, should be denied experiencing fullness of life." In the process of drafting and building consensus around this statement, I learned to appreciate the Jewish concept of tikkun olam found in the Mishnah body of classical rabbinic teachings, where we gain an understanding of how acts of kindness can be performed to perfect or repair the world. The phrase tikkun olam is tied to humans' responsibility for fixing what is wrong with the world. Rabbi Jonah Pessner, the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, ties the beloved community to an ancient conversation between Rabbi Hillel and Shammai. Shammai asks Hillel to explain all of Judaism while he's standing on one foot, and Hillel responds, "What is hateful to you, do not do to any person. The rest is commentary, and go and learn." In Buddhism, so often the moral law of karma is emphasized, in which good actions generate positive consequences and bad actions generate negative consequences. In Islam, I learned a great deal from the organization Islamic Relief Worldwide, which explains at the core of Islamic teaching is the innate dignity conferred by God on every man, woman, and child. The Quran unambiguously declares, "We have bestowed dignity on the progeny of Adam and conferred on them special favor above a great part of our creation. Thus, everyone has a right to live a life worthy of dignity and respect simply by virtue of being human, regardless of race, religion, gender, ability, age, or economic status." According to Islamic Relief, the Islamic principle at the core of preserving the dignity of human beings is justice. And this is evidence from the Quranic injunction, "Be just, for this is closest to God's consciousness." In my own faith tradition, from the biblical prophets through Jesus and the earliest disciples, the Bible has a great deal to say about what the beloved community looks like, even if the two words beloved and community never show up directly together. Jesus' frequent references to the kingdom of God and God's reign of tzedek, mishpat, and hesed, which translate to righteousness, justice, and steadfast love, provide the very essence of what the beloved community looks like and what it means to build it. In Mark's gospel, Jesus begins his public ministry proclaiming that the kingdom of God is at hand. Thus, the way that Jesus lived, taught, healed, and touched lives offers us a window into what the beloved community looks like and how we should go about building it ourselves. In the Hebrew Bible, references to the promised land provide a poignant glimpse into all that relates to the beloved community. The prophet Isaiah offers one of the most powerful visions of the beloved community. From the midst of widespread misery, injustice, and inequity, Isaiah paints a picture of a new heaven and a new earth in chapter 65, in which the tragedies of this world will not need to be repeated. In this new earth, we see community, harmony, tranquility, rejoicing, abundance, long life, productivity, and blessings. It will be a world filled with holistic justice, characterized by right relationships between people and God, neighbor with neighbor, and people with all of God's creation. Yes, indeed, the beloved community. I want to close with reflecting a little bit on a motto that was once the motto of the United States. With some of you history buffs, you may remember this. While it was never codified into law, 𝐏𝐵𝐲𝐿 or out of many one, was the de facto motto of the United States until the year 1956, when Congress adopted "In God We Trust" as the new official motto. I believe that this is a loss, because at its best, the former motto, 𝐏𝐵𝐲𝐿, served as a reminder that America's strength does not derive from some kind of assimilating uniformity, but instead from the richness of authentic expressions of diversity. The older motto, 𝐏𝐵𝗲𝗀𝑠 unum, was inspired in part by the words of the Roman statesman and philosopher Marcus Cicero, who wrote, "When each person loves the other as much as himself, it makes one out of many." In other words, our oneness is not found in a single culture or language or place of origin, but rather our unity can be found in our shared ideals, our shared values, our shared aspirations to make the commitment of liberty and justice real for all. I believe that this is a moment where we must choose to reject the danger of crippling toxic polarization that will continue to move our nation down this vicious cycle of division and acrimony, much of it racialized, and instead choose the path of the beloved community. And what I love about the beloved community is it's not simply about a destination. It is also about the journey. The journey itself will be filled by great joy, even as it will be filled with some significant struggle. The journey of the beloved community will fill us with a deeper sense of meaning, of purpose, and of belonging. Ultimately, the beloved community is about how we change the brokenness of what is and instead replace it with the possibilities of what can and should be. I chose this virtual backdrop for a reason. Some of you may recognize this is an iconic image from the civil rights movement with the United States flag in the background. I believe that this is an opportunity for us to do what I describe in my book, A More Perfect Union, to redeem a sense of patriotism. Redeem it in a way that aligns patriotism with being able to critique all the ways in which our country continues to fall short of its core ideals, even as we celebrate those same ideals. The beloved community did indeed inspire and animate the civil rights movement. And I believe together we can refashion, reimagine what the beloved community can look like for our nation today. And that by joining together and helping to build the beloved community, we can reject the false choice and the danger of autocracy and even fascism, and instead embrace a more inclusive, a more just, multiracial, multi-religious democracy that is aligned with our deepest held and most sacred values. I can't wait to talk to you more, to hear some of your feedback, and hope that together we can indeed put our nation onto the path of the beloved community.
Thank you, Reverend Taylor. That was inspiring and challenging. You've given us much to think about. So now we're going to move into our small group discussions. To ensure that everyone can share their thoughts openly, please keep in mind these ground rules. Keep your mind open to other perspectives. Accept others for where they are in the moment. Be curious. Enjoy the discovery of new ideas. Speak with sincerity and keep your comments brief to allow everyone the opportunity to participate. The questions that will frame the discussions are: what elements of your faith promote openness and respect for people of all races? What elements of your faith have been used to promote or justify racist views? What can we do to augment the positive side and dispel the negative within each faith or through interfaith work? How can persons of races and religions other than the dominant one feel more included? All participants will be moved into a breakout group. You have been randomly assigned to a group. Each group has a trained facilitator. The groups will be about 6 to 8 people. We encourage everyone to share their thoughts. A countdown clock will be visible so that you will know how much time you have and can keep your discussion on track. In a moment, you'll get a message on your screen that you're about to join a breakout group. Please click accept. Here we go. Welcome back. I hope you found the breakout groups beneficial. The conversations probably gave rise to additional questions and insights. While you're thinking about this, I want you to know that you're welcome to sign up for the Sojourners newsletter. The link to the Sojourners website will be placed in the chat box, or I think it has been placed in the chat box for those who are interested. How can religion dismantle racism?
So one of the things I didn't have as much time to get into in my presentation, which I think helps answer this question, is that I kind of offered the very broad, big vision of the beloved community, and definitely love to hear more from your group discussions about to what degree did that resonate or not resonate with you, and even how would you define the beloved community. But in my book, A More Perfect Union, I really try to unpack what the beloved community requires. And I borrow from Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, and I describe there being essentially 6 core commitments that define the beloved community. And I'll just name them, but I'm going to really focus on the first one. So they're a commitment to Imago Dei equality, a commitment to what I describe as Ubuntu interdependence, a commitment to radical welcome, a commitment to nonviolence, a commitment to environmental stewardship, and a commitment to dignity for all. And the one that I think is probably most essential really binds together the Abrahamic faith traditions. Genesis 1 tells us that we are made in the very image and likeness of God. And that core conviction, that core belief means that anytime I denigrate another person or insult another person, or I tear down another person or deny another person their full dignity, I am essentially then attacking or assaulting the very image of God that's within them. When I mentioned briefly that I spent time in South Africa studying in 1996, just a couple of years after Nelson Mandela was elected the first Black president of a new multiracial democratic South Africa. And it was an extremely formative time, transformational time in my life. And I discovered the African kind of philosophy of Ubuntu. Desmond Tutu just described it as I am because we are. It's really, another way of describing the golden rule. And I really kind of fell in love with this concept. And there's, I also learned a bit of Zulu while I was there. I've forgotten most of what I learned, unfortunately, but there's a greeting that has really left an indelible kind of place in my spirit. The Zulu greeting, for how you greet someone is Sawubona, which means I see you, my brother and sister. And the response is Siyakhona, which means I have now been seen. And it's tied into this understanding that until you fully see me and you see my full humanity, in religious terms, you even see the God within me, that I cannot be fully seen and I can't realize my full potential. In other words, our wholeness, our liberation is tied together. It's literally what the prophet Isaiah describes in chapter 58, where he talks about it's only after we engage in acts of justice and compassion that then our light will shine like a noonday and we'll become repairers of the breach, restorers of streets with dwellings. So I think this understanding of Imago Dei is really powerful. And I didn't have a chance to describe this in detail, but this campaign that Sojourners has organized in concert with the National African American Clergy Network and many other partners, including the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism and others, is this campaign, Face United to Save Democracy. And it is an effort to mobilize a multiracial, multi-faith campaign that mobilizes faith leaders to protect the sacred right to vote, push back against many of these bills that are erecting new barriers, new restrictions that are making it harder for in particular, Black and brown voters to exercise the right to vote, and also, literally show up at vulnerable polling sites in order to provide a moral presence. We called it being poll chaplains at polling sites. And we had almost 1,000 poll chaplains in the midterm election, rabbis and clergy, and in some cases imams, that were at polling sites alongside lawyers to try to make sure that everyone could vote freely and fairly. And so it's examples like that I think really help us to really put Imago Dei into action. And we have centered Imago Dei as the core organizing principle of that campaign, because we're trying to break out of the way in which the right to vote has become such a political partisan issue, sadly so, and I think cynically so. But we can transcend that by saying, no, really, the right to vote is a cornerstone of our democracy, yes, but it is also a faith imperative. It is how we exercise our voice and how we protect the most vulnerable in a democratic system, even if that democratic system is flawed. And so, again, Imago Dei can be this critical way that we understand how we combat racism and how we ensure that our democracy is real for everyone.
Thank you. Judith, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Yes, I've got two here. One is a question about how can we make sure that we're not just preaching to the choir, that we're reaching out to extremists who aren't on this call today, for sure, and people that might not understand the things that you're saying about the beloved community. How can we draw them in?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. It's a hard one, but a really great question. So, the one of the kind of core teachings within the Christian faith tradition is that we are called to love our enemies. And, I think, as I mentioned, we have been so conditioned in our political system to see folks that have very different political views or a different political party as our enemy, rather than really trying to see them as fellow Americans, as our neighbors, as people who are also made in the image of God, and probably people that share some of the same values, or at least similar values. But we won't know that until we actually talk to them, or we try to build a relationship with them in some way. I think that there's a lot of hopeful initiatives out there that are trying to both equip people on how they can have brave conversations with people with very, very different political perspectives and views. And there are efforts that are trying to equip houses of worship to be a space where, differences of opinion can better live together and better, build a relationship with one another. Sojourners is designing a curriculum called Bridging Divides that is really designed for congregations and pastors in particular to be able to create, this kind of brave space within churches to have difficult conversations about tough and sometimes divisive political issues, but to root those conversations in some shared principles in terms of how we engage with each other and in some shared values that are biblically centered. And so anxious to be able to share that with everyone. It's going to come out in the next month or so, but certainly that's at least one resource that's out there. There's an organization called Braver Angels that is organizing transpartisan conversations in many communities around the country. And, I think that these are hopeful, but the problem is they're often not at the kind of scale that we need. And so I think that's important. The other thing that I would just emphasize is that our country and our communities have become hyper segregated in many different ways. You could even argue that we are more segregated today in some respects than we were before the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Many of our schools have actually become much more segregated than they were even before then. And there's a survey that comes out each year called the American Values Survey, which is conducted by 𝗣𝗲𝗄. And they found that over 70% of white Americans in this country don't have a single person of color in their close social network. So that's someone that they trust, that they confide in, that they have a close relationship with. And so, it's so much easier to, demonize, let alone distrust someone that you have no relationship with. You haven't heard their story. You don't know anything about their background. You have, no connection with. And so I think we've got to kind of break out of our comfort zones and be willing to try to build more of those relationships. Now, I do want to be really careful, though. I think that, for particularly Black and Brown Americans, to ask them to do that work can put them in danger. It can, be an undue burden. And so, I think that we've got to figure out ways to do that definitely protect people's safety, while, also realizing that, we've got to break out of our comfort zones and be more courageous in how we do it.
Thank you. Judith, you said there was another question?
Yeah, a request to just review again what you meant, how you defined the beloved community and the principles that are involved in that, if you could repeat that.
Absolutely. So my kind of succinct definition is that the beloved community is building a society or a nation where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to race or ethnicity or to gender or to religion or to sexual orientation or to ableness. And it's to create a nation and communities within that nation where everyone is equally valued, everyone has a voice, and everyone is able to thrive. And so that's kind of the, big definition, if you will, although again, I think it's got these kind of practical pieces to it that we can definitely measure. And then, won't kind of go into great depth at this point, but, and I'm not saying this to plug my book, but if you really want to learn a lot more about each of the Beatitudes, they're all, kind of described in the third part of my book. And one of the things that I really do in that third part to really try to get practical is I talk about concrete examples of organizations and people that are living out these Beatitudes. So I talk about, different examples that I'm aware of and that I've been inspired by, because part of what I wanted to do in this book is to kind of spark and catalyze a revolution of building beloved community. And it's already happening all around us. It doesn't always grab the headlines. Unfortunately, the media doesn't really like to tell the good stories very often, but there are so many things that are happening. I'll just name, one example here in DC, and I'm naming it in part because a friend of mine started this organization called Kindred, and they have been working in the DC public school system. And I think they're actually trying to expand to Virginia and to Maryland, where they, based on a lot of studies, it has become increasingly apparent that part of what is driving the racial inequities in educational outcomes is not just economic disparities, but also just huge disparities between Black families and brown families and white families in terms of, just social capital and resources and connections. We know that, those things still really matter in terms of how you get jobs and how you get into college, et cetera. And so they created this program where they bring families together, parents together from very different social, economic, and racial backgrounds. And they go through a very deep process of getting them to listen to each other's stories and to build relationships. And through that process, they develop this kind of deep sense of solidarity and allyship, where many parents then end up advocating for greater equity within the education system itself. It's a really kind of amazing program. It's just one example of many that I can point to, but in each of these Beatitudes, there are all these wonderful examples, and obviously I'm just scratching the surface of what's out there.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments?
You had mentioned there were 5 myths, and you got to discuss 2 of them, that America is a chosen nation and that it's an innocent nation. What were the other 3?
Sure. Yeah, I went through those a little bit fast, so glad you're asking. So additional one is that we're a Christian nation. So I talked a little bit about that while it is true that we were founded on Christian values, the founders, like Thomas Jefferson, were very intent on ensuring that there was no established religion in the United States. And they enshrine in the Constitution the free exercise of religion and the separation of church and state. So that's a third one. A fourth one is that, and to me, this is really kind of the biggest myth, the biggest lie is a lie of white supremacy, that some people are valued more than others because of their skin color, their race, etc. And then a fifth one is somewhat similar to some of the others, but it's called the myth of a nature's nation. In other words, there's a kind of this came out a little bit of the Enlightenment, where the sense that like there's this kind of innate truth that, in particular, white Europeans had, and some of that was used to justify the doctrine of discovery that was mentioned, I think, by one of the participants at one point. So anyway, those are the 5. If you want to learn a lot more about those, I highly recommend Richard Hughes's book, The Myths America Lives By. And in my book, there's a chapter that really summarizes that work and provides a kind of framework that we can use.
Thank you for all your comments, Reverend. One thing that has bothered me for years, and it just continues to get worse, is there are people in America who would describe any effort to acknowledge and dismantle racism anywhere as being woke, and that is somehow bad, that no, you don't want to be woke. So what are some of your ideas of how we can address that attitude and move beyond the kind of dog whistle that represents?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's not coincidental that this kind of attack on wokeness or anti-woke kind of campaign literally took place after, I don't call it a reckoning, because reckoning means we've actually had real policy change, but I think there was a partial racial awakening in the summer of 2020, right? And, a lot of the country responded. You have major corporations that started to make some commitments. They haven't followed through those commitments, but they made commitments around racial justice. You had a kind of shift in public perceptions of policing, et cetera. And that, I think, scared some folks and led to many to try to create kind of a counter movement. And they seized upon this sense of wokeness as a way to try to scare people that, what was really, this agenda is really about, something other than kind of true racial justice, right? And so I do think that this is not going to go away. I mean, this is kind of the clarion call that I would imagine the governor DeSantis is going to run on if he decides to run for president, or others are going to imitate that. I think what we have to do is be really clear about what we mean by racial justice, what we mean by, and kind of tie that to the broader vision of the beloved community or to some other kind of moral vision, and to really, just name the fact that so much of this is being fueled by hatred, hypocrisy, and fear. So I'm a big fan of Howard Thurman, who you may be familiar with, was a theologian and mystic that was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King. And in his seminal book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he describes how the 3 hounds of hell that track the disinherited, in other words, people that are oppressed in this country, are fear, hatred, and hypocrisy. And to me, the kind of woke agenda is all about fear, hatred, and hypocrisy. And you've got to overcome that with greater truth-telling and appeals to love and justice. And so, of course, it's not going to be easy to do, but I think that we have all the kind of resources we need in order to push back against that agenda. And we need to kind of name that this straw man of, for example, of critical race theory is exactly that. And it's being used as a way to drum up fears, particularly of parents, about what their kids are going to be exposed to. When, we got to make the argument that by teaching the fullness of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we are actually helping to empower people, and including our kids, and I include my own 10 and 12-year-old sons in this equation, to better understand how we can make this country live into its full promise and ideals, and not somehow be blind to the injustices of the past, let alone how those injustices show up in the present. Anyway, so much more to say on this one, but I appreciate the question, and I agree this is a real threat, but I actually think that we have the tools and the resources to combat it.
Thank you. Do you have any closing comments that you would like to share with us, Reverend Taylor?
Sure. I mean, really hope that we can find ways to work together. Certainly visit sojo.net to learn more about Sojourners and some of our campaigns. I'll leave you with a quote from Dr. King. You can tell I'm a huge fan. I would highly recommend a book of his sermons called Strength to Love. We're very familiar with his speeches, and those are worth listening to and reading as well. But Dr. King used to say, first and foremost, he was a Black Baptist preacher. And as someone who is also ordained in the same denomination as Dr. King, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, I want to offer up a quote from one of my favorite sermons by Dr. King. And in that sermon, he said this: "The saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but will come through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority." And I know it's kind of a mouthful. What I love about this quote from King is that our faith at its best calls us to be creatively maladjusted to the brokenness and the hypocrisy and the fear and the hatred that we see around us, right? And that is often built into our politics. And it requires that, borrowing from the words of Congressman John Lewis, who I was completely humbled, wrote the foreword to my book, that we've got to get in good trouble, that we've got to be transformed nonconformists. We've got to be the change agents that help to get in the way of injustice and also help to build relationships that can help to lead to the beloved community. And so, I'm hopeful, even though there's lots of things that I'm worried about. I'm still hopeful because I really believe that the beloved community will prevail. And we got to tap into the power of our faith in order to help get there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You have given us a great deal to think about and to work toward. And I'd like to thank all of you who attended the webinar and who participated as facilitators. In a day or two, you'll be receiving a brief survey. Your feedback is very important, so I hope that you will fill that out and return it. Our next event in this series will happen on May 7th. The topic is how our belief in the afterlife influences our attitudes. So please watch for more details and plan to join us again. And now we have a final word from Marie.
Thank you. Well, this has been a wonderful program. I know I've learned a lot, and I think all of us will walk away with some a greater awareness of racism and tools to counter it. And certainly, I have some books now to read. And the thing that has really impacted me right now is I realize we need to start calling people out when they say truth is not woke. And I think we need to make that point and then go on to what Reverend Taylor was talking about, ways that we can help bring the beloved community into being. And I'd like to thank everyone who has participated here, particularly Geneva, who had a lot to do with putting the program, getting Reverend Taylor with us. And thank you to Sydney and to Judith for doing all the logistics to get us set up. So, and thank you, of course, to all the participants. And I hope everyone will walk away with food for thought, certainly, and maybe some tools. So thank you, and hope to see you in May.
To view other workshop videos in this series, click on the playlist button below. To subscribe to our channel and receive notifications of new videos, click on the subscribe button below.